So I wanted to look at what the role of the XP or the BA, whichever role you happen to be in, is in facility stewardship. We've already talked about facility stewardship as a methodology, as a thought process. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But I'm a firm believer that everything on earth belongs to God. The chairs you're sitting in, the cars, the airplanes you used to get here. If that is true, if we truly believe that everything belongs to God, then we have been asked to steward what's been entrusted to us. We are not entitled to our church facilities. We're not entitled to those at all. They've been entrusted to us to take care of because they're God's. People sacrificially gave money in order for us to have those facilities. So one of the key roles as a business administrator or an administrator in general is to face reality. I heard, is anybody familiar with Max Dupree? He was a business consultant. He was the CEO of Herman Miller, the high-end furniture company, which I know all of your churches have Herman Miller furniture in it, right? He said the two roles of a leader is to face reality and say thank you. And so, in order to face reality, one of the key elements is we have to understand the facts. So I'm going to throw a bunch of factual kind of data at you for the next little bit, just so that you've got a starting point of the data that is necessary in order to help you lead your facility team. So we did a benchmarking report back in 2020. It was COVID. There was nothing else to do, so we did a benchmarking report. And we interviewed hundreds and hundreds of churches around the country, ranging from church size of less than 10,000 square feet to over 500,000 square feet of facilities. And we were asking facility budget with staffing, and it came out to be about $5.54. That's what was reported. However, our research shows that your budget should be closer to $6.50 to $7.50 a square foot. So everyone just pause for a second. How much money do you have set aside for maintenance, utilities, and custodial work? Everyone's got that number, I know. Now divide it by your square footage. And if you have to take off your shoes to do the math, I understand. Anybody want to tell me what dollar per square foot they've got? Anybody in that $6.50 to $7.50 range? What we generally find is it's in the $3 to $4 range. And that's just not enough. Here's some benchmarking that will help you in looking at how much you should have set aside. Utilities, somewhere between $1 and $1.50 per square foot. These are annual numbers. This is not monthly. So take your annual utility spend, not including cell phone, not including water unless you have a chiller. Because if you have a chiller, you need water. It's funny how that works. Anybody know that number right off the top of their head? Anybody want to tell me what they're spending per square foot? We worked with a church in Knoxville several years ago that when we did our assessment, they were spending $2.05 a square foot. This is a 200,000 square foot facility. So even above the $1.50 that we had here, they were spending $100,000 more in utilities than what our benchmarking showed. So first thing we did is try to figure out why. Well, we found out that the facility manager didn't know how to use their building automation system, so he just let it run 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Once we showed them the attention of this, they were able to reduce their utility cost $100,000 a year, put that money into a capital reserve fund for which they had $0 to start with. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. General maintenance, somewhere between $250 and $350 a square foot. So general maintenance, just think break fix. Spill on aisle 5. Someone's got to go clean it up. That will include your painting. Painting is something that really should be done on a regular basis. Broken glass, replacing your air conditioning filters, getting your HVAC checked, your fire extinguisher inspections, and so on and so forth. Custodial, somewhere between $1.75 and $2.50 a square foot. This is for your regular custodial work. This would include the paper products and chemicals associated with that work. It also includes your major semi-regular things. If you extract carpet once, twice, 3 times a year, if you do massive window cleaning once or twice a year, that would all fit into there. None of these numbers include a facility manager unless the facility manager is performing actual work tasks associated with that. So under custodial, that $1.75 to $2.50 a square foot might include your custodial staff if they're insourced, or it would include your custodial company if it is outsourced. Everyone following me so far? If your facility manager spends 50% of his time managing the facility and the operations, but he spends 50% of his time turning a wrench, then his 50% of cost for turning a wrench would fit into one of these numbers. Not the managerial part. The managerial part's on top of that. What has happened in the church world that we find way too often is people, any of you who are facility managers, please don't hate me for saying this, but they're given the title of facility manager, but then we expect them to spend 8 hours a day turning a wrench, fixing toilets, and replacing toilet paper. At that point in time, they're really a maintenance tech or a partial custodian. They're not managing the building because they don't have time to review contracts. They don't have time to look for the next best price. They're not looking for how can I extend the life of my equipment another year, 2 years, 3 years. If you have a 50-ton chiller, how much do you think that's going to cost you? $250,000, $300,000? Well, if I can plan ahead and get another 3 years of life out of that, what does that do for the ministry dollars that can now be utilized during that 2 to 3 year period? Again, it goes back to ministry. Yes, sir.
Could you define the difference between maintenance and custodial?
Maintenance is the, I got to change light bulbs. That's a maintenance issue, not a custodial issue. I need to repair a toilet. I need to replace the glass that a kid broke in a door. I need to paint the walls. Those would be maintenance type issues versus custodial is the cleaning, the mopping, the dusting, those kind of things. Now, none of these numbers include your grounds maintenance. Grounds maintenance is harder to quantify because some of you have an acre, some of you have 60 acres. So a good rule of thumb would be somewhere around $6,000 to $7,000 a year per developed acre. And the reason I say developed acre is you may have 60 acres, but only 10 of it is something you have to maintain. You got parking lots, you have to plow, you have to put mulch, or if you're in the south, you put pine needles down. So that's why we use a developed acreage versus total acreage. Then on top of that, $2 to $3 per square foot per year capital reserves. We're going to hit more capital reserves here in just a minute. Pat already alluded to this, but as part of our benchmarking study, we asked the question about how are you utilizing your staff people. And what we found was with the custodial staff, the percentage of time on task, meaning here is your task list for the day. You need to mop these rooms, you need to clean this glass, clean these commodes, and so on and so forth. Here's all of your tasks. Only 65% of the time did they stay on task. So 35% of their time they're doing something that wasn't really on task for them to get completed. Worse is the maintenance staff on average is about a 50% time on task. So, going back to the earlier question about staffing, if if I say I need one per 35,000 square feet, but because of the way we function as a organization, they're only 65% efficient, you need to add that much more to your total FTE count. Or change how you utilize them. And make sure they stay on task longer. The 1 to 35,000 square feet is something that has been a burden on my heart since I started the company. Because I think in the thousands of churches I've worked with, there's less than a handful that actually met the 1 to 35. IFMA, International Facility Managers Association, if your facility manager isn't a part of that, it's a phenomenal resource of material, whether you ever attend a meeting or not. 35,000 square feet is what, they're between 25 and 35. We figured the 35 was a better use for churches. My goal as a company is to figure out a way to help churches get to closer to a 1 to 75 at the efficiency of a 1 to 35. And that's going to be a combination of technology, software, best practices. It's not all going to be products that we sell. I'll give you an example. How many of you have multiple places on your campus that you keep all of the right size ladders instead of all in a garage someplace on the back 40? How many of you have multiple rooms? Okay, 1 or 2, great. About what, every 200 feet, Nathan? About every 200 feet, you should have a ladder closet with all the right size ladders that your staff would need to replace a light bulb, to replace an exit sign, to do all those kind of things. So they're not running and wasting off-task time to get things done. How many of you use a maintenance cart when they walk in the morning and they've got maintenance tasks to do and they've got a maintenance cart to start the day? How many of you? Okay, so we've got a handful. Instead of having to run back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, off task, it's better to have the maintenance cart. So let's do a fun little exercise. How many of you think it is cheaper to have your staff paint a room than it is to hire a professional painter? How many think it's just cheaper to have your staff? I mean, you're paying them already, right? Sometimes. Yeah. So I actually asked a painter to give me a quote on a room. And then we watched someone else on staff paint that room. And it took so much longer and cost so much more, not just in the cost of painting that room, but in then the lost opportunities because they couldn't go do the things that they should have been doing anyway. And sometimes we think it's always cheaper. We're paying them anyway. We'll just get them to do it. We'll get them to. Nathan and I were at a facility 2 years ago in San Diego. Very large, multi-campus church, 16,000 people on a weekend. They were grossly understaffed. They had eight full-time people. We were, what, 300,000 square feet? Yeah, about 300,000 square feet. And no joke, we've got pictures we put in the report of 2 of their understaffed people pushing a hand truck with bottles of water that they were delivering to all the different ministry areas. Off task. Is that really what you want? Wouldn't it have been better to have asked the vendor to do that for you and allow them to have the time to inspect the building, get on the roof, do the things that only a human can do versus things that someone else can do? So this is a fairly significant thing. How many of you have a capital reserve account? Okay. How many of you think you have enough money in it to do what you need to do if at the time you need to do it? Well, David, you're kind of the exception to the rule here. Just keep going. David sat in on way too many of my workshops already. So let me give you 3 facts real quick. Number 1, all buildings deteriorate at a rate of 1 to 4% a year. This is not a Timism. This is International Facility Managers research. You notice it says all buildings. It does not say all church buildings. So I don't care if it's a hospital, a 7-Eleven, or a cathedral. natural resources and materials deteriorate at a rate of 1 to 4% a year. So you got to have at least that much money that you're budgeting just to break even on what's the deterioration factor. The second is with that deterioration, you're going to replace nearly every physical component of your building at some point in time. This is not an if question. This is a when and how much. It's inevitable. You will replace every roof, every air conditioning unit, every stitch of carpet. You will replace or resurface every parking area that you've got. These are inevitabilities. And because you're going to do that, you got to have dollars. Greenbacks, moolah, dinero, whatever we want to call it. I don't know too many roofers these days that trade sheep and goats for new roofs. Okay, we have way blown past that time in culture. You got to have dollars. So what is the most motivating capital campaign known to mankind? Oh, it's asking money to replace the roof in the air conditioning unit. Not, said no one ever. Okay? I've had been in workshops where I'm heavily attended by millennials. And when I talk about this, they'll say, you mean the 60-year-olds didn't know that they were going to have to replace that roof at some point in time and they didn't plan for it? I'm not giving money to that. I'm going to buy a pair of Tom's shoes and donate a pair to a kid in Africa because that's going to change somebody's life. Why should I take care of something that you all should have thought about 30 years ago when you put that new roof on? So when I think of capital reserves, the easiest way, particularly now that I'm in my 60s, the easiest way for me to think about capital reserves is like a 401k. How many of you put money in a 401k to spend it the next month? How many of you that have a retirement account start off with not thinking about how much you'll need at retirement? And is that future amount of money the same dollar cost as it would be in today's dollars? No. Between inflation, I mean, I'll probably retire in about 45 years or so. And I know at even a 3 to 5% inflation per year, it's going to cost me, I'm going to have more money set aside for retirement than I needed today if I were going to retire. Same thing with your facilities. We don't retire our church facility, but you will retire nearly every component in your facility. You may not retire the footings and structural steel and some of those kind of things, but nearly everything else is going to be retired at some point in time, even down to windows and doors. How many of you have buildings that were built in the 30s and 40s that you've gone in and replaced windows with more energy efficient, and it's actually saved you money even though you had to spend the money to do it? Those are the type of things we're looking at. So we asked the question in our benchmarking is, how do you fund a capital reserve? We had everything based on project needs, based on desire and amount, gross receipts, and so on. So I pulled the data from that, and I was really encouraged because it looked like 70% or more had a plan for capital reserves. And I'm like, man, I've been preaching up the wrong tree here for way too many years. Until we dug into it a little bit further. 60% did not have a defensible way of planning for it. Meaning, it was, it's over or left over at the end of the year, we'll put it into a capital reserve. Well, what happens if there's nothing left over? Is that HVAC equipment going to say, I'm going to take the year off, and you don't have to count this year against when you need to replace me because you didn't have enough money left over? No, it's not. It's going to have to still be replaced in a certain amount of time. When we look at the life cycle of owning a facility, now I didn't say of building a building. This is of owning a facility. The majority of the costs And we actually did a regression study on this to look at how much does it cost to operate a facility over 40 years. Does anybody have a building that's less than 40 years old? Okay, David, got a couple. How many of you have buildings that are over 40 years old? For those with buildings under 40 years old, you hope that they last 40 years.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we don't build buildings with the hopes that it'll only last 10 years. We just don't do that. So when you look at this, the 40-year benchmark is kind of an industry standard, not just in the church facility management world, but in all sectors. Because you build a building, you expect it to last at least 40 years. When you look at what it costs to operate with maintenance, with capital reserves, utilities, janitorial, it's 71% of the cost of owning that building. Only 20% of it was the cost of building it. But you look at an inflationary factor tied to ongoing recurring costs, and that's where your money is spent as a church. It is not on the sticks and bricks. And yet, where does everybody get the most excited? Sticks and bricks, shiny new thing. And we forget that we have to maintain it for decades and decades to come. The reason we started the business in the first place is I spent 24 years building churches across the country. And I would walk into a church that was 5 years old that looked like a 20-year-old building. I actually had this is funny, I had a client, I won't mention the church's name, in Nashville that built a 60,000 square foot addition to their campus. And at the end of that first year, the pastor had a hissy fit that the utility cost had gone up and they spent more money on toilet paper. Okay, so if you add a bedroom to your house, do you think your utility bills are going to go up? If you have another bathroom in your house, are you going to use more water than you did the year before? Yeah. And yet we don't plan on that. Oh, we build a building and God somehow or another just makes everything work out fine and we don't have to worry about it. One of the key, what we as a company have kind of dubbed as the church killer is deferred maintenance. COVID really shone a light on this. It was not a pleasant period during COVID for us because Nathan and I did several assessments on churches that we had to do the assessment to prove to them why they had to shut their doors. Because they couldn't afford to keep them open. When you have a church that relies on outside group rental just to pay the bills, and now you don't have outside group rental and you can't afford to keep the building going. We had one client in Charlotte, downtown church, that was spending 70% of their budget on maintaining the building. I looked at the pastor and said, "You're no longer a church. You're a property management company that meets on Sunday." They had no ministry money. By the time they paid their staff, there was no ministry money at all. They just had a place to meet on Sundays and keep calling themselves a church. When you look at deferred maintenance, and I'm afraid you're probably going to start experiencing this with the reduction you've had in custodial work. Deferred maintenance means we just didn't get to what we should have done. We knew we should have done it, but we didn't do it. I've used the example for years, and it's a real story of a church down in Hilton Head area, South Carolina. It's a terrible place to work, but somebody had to do it. I volunteered. The church that I had built, and they wanted to go inexpensive up front. Now, does anybody realize that Hilton Head's near an ocean? And there's a thing called salt water in the ocean, and salt water corrodes and damages things. Well, 10 years after they moved into this building, that was a very nice building, they said, "Hey, can you come look at our windows for us?" I said, "Sure." And they weren't working very well, and some of them were starting to fall apart. I said, "Well, when was the last time you caulked your windows?" Blank stare. "What? Have you ever bought a tube of caulk at Lowe's or Home Depot? How long is it warranted for?" 1 year, unless you get the really good stuff, then you get maybe 2 years. What happens when you have a crack on the outside of a window in the caulk area and it rains? Where does water go? Inside the wall. Deferred maintenance means I haven't caulked that window and I just let water get in there. And what ends up happening then down the road, 3, 4, 5 years if I haven't attended to this? What happens to the insulation in that wall? What happens to the drywall in the room? What happens to the wood studs that are in that area? When you start looking at this church, we did a quick study to say, okay, if you'd have taken 10 years and caulked those windows every year, it would have cost you between $5,000 and $6,000 a year in manpower and in caulk. Instead, they spent nearly $30,000 to replace the windows. Oh, but we can't afford to do that caulking at $6,000, but we can afford $30,000 to replace windows. The math just doesn't work. And yet I understand it's hard to convince your finance team why you needed that $6,000 over a 10-year period, instead of going and having to rob Peter to pay Paul to replace those windows. These are pictures of real assessments that we have done as a company. Does anybody see any deferred maintenance? This has got to be my favorite. This is Nathan and I did this. This was a church that in their infinite wisdom bought a mall, 1 million square foot mall for a church of 1,000 people. And instead of removing the old air conditioning units, they just decided to roof over them. Yeah, you can't make this stuff up, not even in the church world. But look at this picture for a minute. What do you see that's going to be inevitable if this isn't corrected? Pardon? Settling. Yep, foundation. There's a pond of water right here. $5 of black pipe would have solved this. But what will likely end up happening is in 10 or 15 years, they're going to come back and have to replace this sidewalk at significant dollars instead of being proactive and avoid the deferred maintenance altogether. So here's a little fun fact that no one actually wants to know. And this is something that Pat and Nathan have really shown a light on. We've done millions and millions of square feet of facility assessments. And so we keep all the data on all of that. What we have found is that on average, there's between $25 and $40 per square foot of deferred maintenance in the facilities we inspect. So quickly run the number, how many square feet do you have? Multiply it by 25 to 40, and you likely are in that camp of the amount of deferred maintenance that you have in your facility. If that's the case, how are you going to remedy that? Oh, we'll just use the capital reserve money to do that. Okay, that's great. Now, when that unit needs replaced, where's the money coming from to replace it? This is a significant issue for churches. And unfortunately, we end up being the bearer of bad news for many of them to let them know, hey, your congregation is down to 60 people, but you've got $2 million worth of maintenance. Brad knows this because he and I've known Brad since he was a toddler, almost. And we're in the same town, but we worked with a church in Charlotte that when we looked at the facility, the church had a $900,000 budget. They were running 200 people, so they had a good budget for the number of people, but they had $4.5 million of deferred maintenance. How are you ever going to get caught up? The only solution was to bulldoze the building, partner with a developer, get a new building built, sell off part of your land so you can afford to get the new building built, and so on and so forth. We see more and more of that happening right now because churches can't afford to take care of the facility. So they're looking for alternative ways to leverage the resources God's entrusted to them. And so partnering with developers and so on and so forth. These are our numbers. Now, there were 2 reports done in the last 5, 6, 7 years. One by the NEA, National Education Association, the union, and then a green organization that was looking at deferred maintenance in school systems. Matter of fact, their reports showed that the public school systems in America has $500 billion of deferred maintenance. Billion. There's only 95,000 public schools in America. There's 350,000 churches. Now granted, many of those schools are bigger than churches, I get that. But if you've got $500 billion in school deferred maintenance, doesn't bode well for the church world with that many more facilities, particularly for an organization that says that we're good stewards of God's stuff. So when you think about this, for every dollar in deferred maintenance, it costs you $4 of capital renewals later on. Yeah, we'll put it off, we'll put it off. And then we're going to spend at least 4 times. And one report said it could be 30 times. The example of the window without the caulking. I could spend $100, $150 to caulk all those windows, or I can wait 10, 12 years, not only replace the windows, but then have to replace drywall and insulation, and it's easily 30 times the cost of that. Is everybody having a good time? So I'm not going to go real deep in budgeting, but I want to talk a little bit about how we budget and one of the pitfalls. So how many of you, when you're looking at your budgets, particularly facility budgets, you look at what you spent last year and you add a percentage to it for the next year? A lot of you? Okay. That's not uncommon. You are all in good company. I'd like to challenge the thinking a little bit, though. Is if you're taking what you spent and just adding a multiplier to it, are you sure you spent the right amount in the previous year? The example I gave earlier about the Knoxville church, they were spending 55 cents a square foot too much of our high end for utilities. And they just kept adding money to the budget year over year, and they were already spending close to 25-30% more than they should have been spending from the get-go. So using a percentage as a part of that is trouble for sure. The other part is what happens when the church budget goes down. Do you reduce the facility budget accordingly? Did you magically eliminate part of your square footage that now you don't, hey, the budget dropped 20% for the whole church. Okay, fine, tithes and offerings are down, I get that. But did we lose 20% of our facility that we don't have to maintain anymore, and we don't have to clean it anymore, and we don't have to plan on capital reserves anymore? Likely not. And so one of the questions we get asked regularly is, what percentage of the church budget should facilities be? And I never use that as a factor. I may use it backwards to make sure that it's in proper proportion. But if church budget goes down and church's income goes down, unless you are closing off part of your building, bulldozing part of your building, doing something like that, you still got the same amount of building to clean and maintain and replace. If anything, as the church's budget goes down, the amount for facilities actually needs to go up. So now to kind of the meat of, that's all the background. So I was a pastor's kid, I can talk all day, we'll be here until 7. So, who is responsible for facility stewardship? Anybody want to venture a guess? I believe it starts at the top. Does anybody recognize that young man? That's Walt Disney. He would go around and he'd pick up the trash. The creator of Disney World and Disney movies, when he saw trash, he'd go pick it up. The story is told, whether true or not, that when they first opened the first Disneyland in California, Walt Disney took either an ice cream cone or a bag of popcorn, whichever one you want to believe, and he would walk until he was finished with it and said, that's where the next trash can goes. Because for him, it made more sense to add a few more trash cans along the way than to have to pay people to pick up trash. leaders pick up the trash. And so it starts at the top with you all, with your lead pastors, with your elders, with those in charge. If they're responsible for facility stewardship, your staff and congregation isn't entitled to the facilities. It's been entrusted to them as well. They need to take some ownership of this. How many of you require your office personnel to take out their own trash?
I do it, but I'm the only person generally at the district office who can do it, so.
Okay.
A whole lot of this falls on me.
God bless you. You know, Nathan and I are big advocates on let the staff take out their own trash. Make it easy on them, and somewhere in the administrative office, put a 55-gallon trash can where they can all put their trash in and refill their trash cans with empty liners so they don't have to go find new liners. So your staff, your custodial team can go add extra liners in the bottom of their trash can. They can even replace the bags for them if need be because they're going to be in there doing other cleaning duties. But what time might that save if the staff, particularly if you've got 20, 30, 40 people on staff, could save you from your team having to go do those kind of things? There needs to be a sense of responsibility. We had two very large churches get together. We sponsored an event where we brought in a very large West Coast church and a very large East Coast church, both multi-site, ranging between 15 and 30,000 people each. And we asked, who does your setups, your room setups? And the one church was like, oh, well, the facility team does all the setups. We get requests, we set up, we're busy all day long doing setups. The other church was, our facility team only does setup for church-wide events. If you're having a Bible study on Tuesday night, whoever's leading that sets it up, tears it down, puts it back into the way it was supposed to be. How do we shift some of that entrusted versus entitled mindset to our staff, to our volunteers, so that they take as much ownership as you all do? It's not just a facility responsibility. I really believe that if we all believe that everything belongs to God and we have a church facility that's been entrusted to us, it's not just the paid staff. In the same way, evangelism is not the responsibility of just the paid pastors. If we truly believe that we are ministers, we are responsible for evangelism and discipleship, and not just those with the name pastor in their name. Same thing applies to our facilities. The ability to maintain a facility is in direct correlation and priority with the value given to the facility manager and the team. I wrote a blog a number of years ago, is your facility manager the redheaded stepchild of the staff? To which one redheaded person took offense and wrote me about it. There's always one. James, are you actually in an office or are you in a cloffice?
We're in a cloffice.
Cloffice, which is really a storage closet that they put a desk in. I've been in facility managers' offices that were in the basement or in a boiler room, or actually one of them was in a chain link fenced area of the basement. They put them in the basement, put chain link fencing around it, and said, that's your office. Everybody else was in a really nice posh office upstairs, and yet we asked that person to be responsible for a multi-million-dollar facility. What's wrong with that? If the leadership doesn't see the value in your facility manager and their team, they're not going to value facility stewardship as a whole. Am I stepping on any toes yet? Maybe your staff members' toes. So, facing reality, one of your first roles as an administrator at your church, you have to grasp the value of your facility. How many of you, at least every once or 2 years, your insurance company comes to you and says, your building's now worth this, and so this is what your insurance premium is going to go up to? Most of you probably get that. Do you ever look at how many zeros and commas are in that number? How many of you have over 100,000 square feet? Okay. In today's dollars, at almost $300 a square foot to build a new building, what's your building worth if you had to build it new today? And you had to buy the land, and you had to put the parking in, and you had to put pews or theater seats or chairs, and God forbid you have to put a new AVL system in, because that's more money than the land right there. Audiovisual lighting system, the sound system. If we don't grasp that our buildings are complex, commercial, highly expensive buildings, we're not going to grasp the need to take care of it. I shared with Matt Gates, who's leading the XP group next door. When I work with a church and they have an executive pastor, not a business administrator, and frankly the terms are somewhat synonymous. If that executive pastor is heavy on the pastor side, not the executive side, and most likely came out of a pastoral role, they don't think a capital reserve account is even necessary. God will bless and He will provide. If I work with those on the heavy executive of the executive pastor's side, and particularly those that have come from a secular marketplace, capital reserves are top of their list, because they know the value of what it costs to build or rebuild a physical building. And they understand what it's going to cost to maintain it. So first thing is you got to understand the value of the facility. You have to face the reality of your operations cost. Are you at $650 to $750 a square foot? If not, how do you get there? It may take you 5 or 10 years to get there. But if you started adding 25 cents a square foot year over year, you're eventually going to start getting there, as long as you can keep up with inflation. Really understand, are you paying too much or too little in different areas? We have empirical data on all the facility assessments we've done. There are 2 primary causes for deferred maintenance: understaffed in facilities and under-budgeted in general maintenance. Without a doubt, every church that has deferred maintenance that we've ever done, that's 100%, they are lacking in those 2 areas. They don't have enough facility staff, and they don't have enough budget money to care for the building. So we put off to tomorrow what should have been done today, and that grows exponentially. Matter of fact, the rate of inflation of deferred maintenance, I mentioned the 1 to 4% of deterioration. That more than doubles when it's not taken care of in its current year. So you keep putting things off, and now all of a sudden that 4% goes to 8% deterioration, 8% to 16% deterioration, and it gets worse and worse and worse until you can't use your facility. Is the facility team incorporated into your culture? Are they bought into the why it's important to keep the facility looking and operating at peak operation? Do they understand the impact on a first-time guest? Do they understand that if they can run the building efficiently, not cheap, efficiently, that might actually free up dollars for ministry? It's not just about the facilities here. Ultimately, we want to impact people's lives. The facility is just a component of that. Is the facility manager a valued and respected member of your leadership team? Do they get invited to the C-suite meetings? Is your facility manager ever brought in, if you're thinking about doing a renovation or a new construction project, are they brought into the discussion so that you don't end up with a chandelier that's 40 feet in the air that you can't replace the light bulbs on? Have you thought about have you brought your facility manager in when the children's director wants to talk about VBS next year? And by the way, that VBS is going to have a day in the sanctuary where we're going to blow bubbles everywhere. Okay, if the facility manager is not part of that discussion to help you understand why that may not be a good idea, Or if the facility manager isn't part of the discussions about, oh, we're going to decorate for Christmas and we're going to use Scotch tape on all the walls to hang up all the decoration.
Too soon.
Sorry, David. If they're not part of your leadership team's discussion, you're missing out on their expertise and their understanding of these things. They're not there to be the no person. They should be there, if they're treated with respect, to be the how can we person. How could we do this? If we can't use Scotch tape, what's an alternative? Well, let's use some blue painter's tape. Or I'll put up a system across the whole thing that we can then use thumbtacks in, and then we take it back out, and now that system's up there, like you see maybe in an art gallery or in the lobby of a nice building. Fully vet the inevitable costs of your capital renewals. If you don't know how much money you're going to need over the next 10 to 15 years, you're missing part of your responsibility of financial stewardship that's coupled with facility stewardship. If you can't go to your finance team and say, hey, in 7 years, we have 3 air conditioning units that are likely going to have to be replaced. We're going to do everything we can to make it 8 years or 9 years. But just know that in 7 years, it's high probability we're going to have to replace those. And in today's dollars, that's going to cost us X amount. And at inflation, we're going to need this amount of money in 7 years. Where's that going to come from? How are we going to plan for it? That's a whole lot better stewardship than waiting until the day it breaks. And as Pat said, having to rent a portable unit. I mean, can you imagine when people ask me, well, how do I convince my pastor and my staff about this? Just say, okay, if I am in Phoenix in August and the air conditioner breaks and it's a 6-month lead time because it's a 50-ton chiller that still hasn't been built, you don't walk into Lowe's and buy a chiller. How long could we do church, and at what cost to the ministry if we can't have church because there's no air conditioning in Phoenix in the middle of August? Fully vet the staffing requirements of your facility. The 1 to 35 is ideal. You know, if you've got 40,000 square feet, the 1 to 35 may work. Yeah, a little bit. You may have to outsource a few things so that you can make the numbers work. Then fully understand your funding. How are you going to fund the things that need to be done? And keep in mind it is a complex commercial structure. We call it the house of God, but it ain't no house. How many of you have chillers and boilers in your home? How many of you have 50,000 square feet of flat roof area at your home? Or have a parking lot that has thousands of cars in a month's time that drives on it and wears it out? We don't. The principles still apply. If you have a home, you should have a capital reserve account in your own home and everything else. So this isn't, I mean, it goes back to the Fram oil filter. For most of you that are old enough to remember, what was the saying with the Fram oil filter? Pay me now or pay me later? Okay? Same thing applies. How many of us would go 5, 6, 7, 8 years without changing the oil in our vehicle? We wouldn't. But yet we'll let our church facilities go 5, 10, 15 years without doing the proper maintenance to keep it operational at peak performance. By the way, secular organizations grasp this whole ROI a whole lot better than we do. The second question is, when was the last time you had an open and honest conversation with the facility team? Are they really part of your staff? Do you honor them? Do you respect them? You know, how are you doing personally and at home? When was the last time you asked your facility team members that? Remember, they're human beings. They got a soul. It'd be nice to see them in heaven with us. How is your work environment? Do you have what you need? Are the resources and tools everything you need to do your job? Again, these are questions. This is pure leadership 101. You don't have to solve all of these immediately. But if you're not caring for your people to ask the right questions, how will you know what they're going to need now and in the future? Are you getting the support you need? Are there any decisions you need me to make? Again, that's a leadership 101. What obstacles or decisions can I make for you to make your job more palatable, more functional? What do you see coming down the road that's going to need to be done? You may think you know what's going to need to be done, what capital reserves or whatever else. I assure you, they know a whole lot better than you do what's coming down. So I did go to the men's restroom during the break. They got one commode that's barely hanging off the wall. There's no caulk around it at all. Okay, what's going to happen if they don't repair that over time? You've seen the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the Leaning Urinal of Lexington. They had 3 light fixtures in the ceiling that were hanging out of the ceiling by at least that much. There was a crack in the floor, and there were 3 holes drilled in some tile that they had just patched up with bubble gum, I think. I spent less than a minute and a half in there. Those were my first impressions. I saw those things. Your facility staff should already know those things and be able to document them to you so that you can start making a plan of what to do. How do we attack deferred maintenance? That's another question you need to ask your team, because inevitably you have deferred maintenance. So what's our plan to attack that? Third responsibility is to listen, and this time for real. Again, listening versus hearing, 2 totally different skill sets. I hear my wife, I don't always listen to her. It is great to ask questions, but are you really listening to what they're saying? Then after you ask the question after the question. How are you doing? How's things going? Oh, everything's great. Okay, how's your wife doing? Oh yeah, she's struggling a little bit. Well, how are the kids doing? Ask the question after the question. Keep it away from the superficial side of things. And don't stop with the initial response. Push and dig deeper. Facility staff as a whole are often hard-shelled people. You got to peel that onion back. And you're not going to do it at one conversation in the hallway in 30 seconds. It's going to have to be continuous and ongoing. It's never a one and done, and I don't care who you're leading or managing. And then the 4th step is to take action. Take the information that you get and prioritize it. You can't do it all at once. Number one, you don't have the budget probably to do it, nor would it be prudent to try to do it all at one time. So I just got back from a 45-day sabbatical. God bless America. What a wonderful time. It was the most wonderful time. It was the most awful time ever. After 3 days, my wife's like, oh, you can never retire. Get out of my business. Put that sweeper down. Don't ever wash the dishes again. Seriously. I was stepping all in her business, and I was a miserable person. And then I finally got into a groove, and it was kind of fun. But the Tim of 10, 15 years ago would have come back with 2 stone tablets chiseled with 50 to 60 items that we were going to do. And I have those 50 items written down. But what I did coming back last week for the first time is I said, okay, I'm just going to listen. I wanted to just regurgitate and say, here's all the things we're going to do, and you all just figure it out. So you got to prioritize, and then give them in bite-sized pieces what can they actually handle. If there are cultural paradigms that you need to make adjustment on, start working towards that. So what I mean is, do you value your facility staff? How do you show them that you value them? How do you bring them into the discussions that they need to be a part of? Then establish a plan to address the items that have been brought to you. Don't let it go in one ear and out the other. Actually start establishing a plan and include your facility team in that process. Hey, I'm thinking about prioritizing these 5 things and then these next 5 things. And they say, oh, but if we don't get to this 10th item sooner, we're going to be in real trouble. Again, you may think you know the right priority, but if you don't involve the team, how are you ever going to really know? Help them to see that you're part of the team. You're part of the solution. And just so you all know, if anybody wants these slides, I'll send them to you. I'll email them to you. Just give me a business card and an email address or something. And then fund the plan as is reasonable. Hey, we really think we need 10 new scissor lifts for our 10,000 square foot building. That's probably not reasonable. I'll tell you what, we're going to, next year's budget, I'm going to budget enough money to rent a scissor lift 3 times a year. How does that sound? Okay, you've created a plan, you're going to fund it appropriately for what you need. Act. That's not an acronym, that's a word. We need to act on the plan. And then update that team regularly. Hey, this was the plan. Hey, something has happened and tithes and offerings are down. We're going to have to delay these 5 items. Don't let them think that you have forgotten about them. Let them know, hey, we're going to have to adjust this plan. Or, hey, we had a big donor that came and we're going to be able to take on 3 more items this year than what I thought we were going to do. Which 3 do you think are the best 3 to take on? But involve them in the process. You would do the same thing if you were over the youth pastor, the children's minister. You would be asking them, okay, if we have these things or if we need to cut back, how do we do this together? Instead of just saying, yep, facilities is cut 25%, good luck. And the last thing is rinse and repeat. This is an ongoing thing that needs to happen on a regular basis.